Before we begin the gospel reading, I'm going to be asking you this question as we move through the gospel and the sermon. Okay? Richard will be reading passages. I will be, I will be preaching in between. So the good news for you watching at home, when the gospel's finished, so is the sermon. So this is the question, this is the lens that I want all of us to be looking at this gospel text through. What is this text proclaiming about Jesus, life, and death? Okay.
Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." But when Jesus heard it, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Accordingly, though, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. After having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was.
Jesus loved Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And prior to this point, Jesus has healed strangers. Now he is confronted with somebody he dearly loves who is in need. When Mary and Martha sent a message to Jesus saying, "Lord, he whom you love is ill," their expectation is what? That Jesus will drop everything and get to Bethany. What would our expectations be? Yeah, Jesus would drop everything and get to Bethany. But everything that Jesus does, its purpose is to glorify God first and to bring life to the world, not just a favored few. The reason that Jesus stayed away was not because he was indifferent, but because Jesus will return to... Oh, wait a minute. I'm jumping the gun. No, I guess I'll be okay. Let me say it again. The reason that Jesus stayed away was not because of indifference, but because he will return to Judea and risk death for the sake of his disciples and for Lazarus.
Then after this, he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Judeans were just now trying to stone you, and you are going there again?" Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble, because they see the light of this world. But those who walk at night stumble, because the light is not in them. After saying this, he told them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will be all right." Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. For your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Thomas, who was called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us go, that we may die with him."
Let's go back to our original question. What is this text proclaiming about Jesus' life and death? Well, Jesus' everyday life has been pierced by really bad news that somebody that he loved was gravely ill. Our everyday life has been pierced and turned upside down by this pandemic that has touched every part of our normal lives. The other thing is that Jesus is not letting fear control his actions. He is going to go to Judea. Had we been together, we would have talked about the man born blind last week. He's going to go back to where they were going to put him to death. They were not happy that he called the Pharisees blind. And he was going to go right back into the throes of a dangerous situation. But remember Jesus' purpose. It's not to protect his life, but everything he does is to glorify God and to bring life to his disciples and to the world. He will not let fear control his actions, nor should we let fear control our actions. Of all times, it is for us to be the light and salt in the world, and not to fall prey to being afraid of strangers, but in ways that are safe for us to still continue to be the body of Christ in a world that needs that love and that comfort more than ever.
When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Judeans had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection of the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world."
Death separates us from life and breaks the relationship that we have with other people. And death is a potent threat that frequently people in power use. Jesus is now confronting Martha, and there is reproach, maybe disappointment in her words when she says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Many of us have probably said that when we have been at the bedside of somebody that we loved. But Martha goes on to say, "But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus says, "Your brother will rise again." And Martha says, "I know that he will rise in the resurrection on the last day," but in parentheses, probably not today. Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life." And I'm going to go Greek on you. Ego eimi. Jesus is saying God's name. I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live, And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? And Martha takes the place of Peter in her affirmation of faith. She says, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world."
When she had said this, she went back and called her sister, Mary, and told her privately, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Judeans who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see."
Jesus got another refrain of, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Mary was in the house, but yet she came to Jesus. She heard his voice. She was one of his sheep. And she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping and the Judeans who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. Right now, we don't have, maybe luxury is too strong of a word, but we cannot group together for this time, for the time being, with people who are grieving. And my heart hurts for people who cannot be with their loved ones as they are dying because of the self-isolation that is necessary to protect the healthcare workers as well as other patients. But the good news of this gospel is that no one dies alone. Even if the family can't be with them, even if their pastor or priest or rabbi cannot be with them, God's got them. God is with them. And so these days of separation will end. But it is also time to know that although our presence is welcome and we yearn to be there with people we love, God is with them already.
Jesus began to weep. So the Judeans said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not he have opened the eyes of the blind man, have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench, because he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Many of the Judeans, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him.
What is this text proclaiming about Jesus' life and death? Well, about Jesus. Jesus is not unmoved by the grief that we feel. And Jesus was deeply moved and greatly disturbed, angry by the power of death. Because right now, the power of death is still in full force. Because Jesus, the Son of God, has not yet been glorified, which in the Gospel of John means that he has not yet been crucified. This story of Lazarus happens in the 11th chapter, and it is foreshadowing Jesus' own impending death. In a way, Lazarus is coming out of the tomb, and Jesus will very soon be laid in a tomb. This is also the first part in the story that is titled Lazarus. This is the first time Jesus has turned his attention to Lazarus, dead Lazarus. And Fred Craddock said, and I think we followed it, he said, the preacher should not arrive at Lazarus' tomb before Jesus does. There is a process here, and that's why I like to preach in the midst of this gospel narrative, because you don't want to cut to the chase because you miss so much. So, they're at the tomb, and Jesus says, "Take away the stone." Martha, always practical, says, "Lord, it's going to stink. It's going to be a powerful stinking," because that's something about death. It stinks. It decays bodies. It is awful. But Jesus says, with us in the toughest of times, he said, "I don't care. Get rid of that stone." And then he says, "Did I not tell you that you would see, if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" All Martha's worrying about is stinking Lazarus. So they took away the stone. And Jesus looks upward and prays, because he wants to make it apparent where this power to bring Lazarus back to life is coming from. And it declares that Jesus is not acting alone. And when Jesus says, "Lazarus, come out," his cry shatters death. Jesus calls Lazarus by name. Jesus said, "Unbind him and let him go." Lazarus will die again. And the irony of this story, if you read ahead past where the lectionary ends, this really got the people in Jerusalem upset. And now Lazarus, who had just been brought back from the dead, and Jesus, who was still in trouble with them for restoring the sight of the man born blind, they were now on a death list. Ironic. A man who's been brought back from the dead by the power and love of God is now on a human death list. Our human superpower is to make people dead. And we can do it in a horrific number of ways. And that's how people in power keep other people afraid. I can make you dead, and you're not going to like it. But God's superpower is to bring life to where death once reigned. So, through Lazarus and his resurrection, that brought belief to the people who were there and Jesus' disciples. But Jesus' death and resurrection will bring life to all. We do not need to be afraid, even though fear permeates every aspect of our lives. So here's a suggestion. Turn off the news. Breathe in air. Go outside when you can. Wash your hands. And look at your hands, knowing that you have been lovingly created by God. Not for fear, but for love. And know that no matter how insurmountable this is, we all have a part to play. And if we can slow the roll of this infection by sheltering in place and maintaining social isolation or social distance, then we'll do it because we care for the welfare of the community. We are Christ's body. And when someone suffers, we all suffer. And so we want to be part of the healing. And we yearn for the day. I yearn for the day when I see faces, your faces, in the pews that are in front of me now. And I know that day will come. But in the meantime, know that you are beloved children of God. Amen.